I think propaganda has come to have a very negative implication. We think of propaganda as a bad thing. It wasn't always that way. In fact, it's quite a recent idea that it's always bad. If you look back to the beginning of the 20th century, you find that people are using propaganda quite neutrally. You know, there's our propaganda and their propaganda. And really, it's taken on a kind of colouring of being always evil, of trying to change people's minds, trying to bully them, trying to con them in some way. But I think that has crept in, essentially. It's probably even a post-World War II trend. But if we go back to the early years of the First World War, for instance, when there's a lot of talk about propaganda, then it's just something which we all do. Cinema had come fairly late to Russia, and I think you have to understand that background to the fact that the Bolsheviks really took up cinema with a vengeance. We got these statements like Lenin saying in 1923, cinema is the most important of all the arts for us. And Stalin also says it's really important, and Trotsky too. So they all agree that cinema is really important, whether they like it or not. It meant that the new generation of young Soviet directors, people who identified themselves as Soviet, really had a lot of backing for what they were doing. If they did something that was seen as good propaganda, then it got a lot of support. Although I think the Soviet state was a bit surprised by the impact that some of those early films had. Eisenstein's films of the 1920s were all commissioned films. They were films that were designed to spread the message. The message, in the case of Potemkin, that the Russian Revolution had started way back in 1905. In the case of October, it was to commemorate the Great October Revolution. But many people were not happy with the picture that Eisenstein gave of the Great October Revolution. They said it was too intellectualized, too symbolic, didn't really deal with the nitty-gritty of the revolution. It wasn't really a newsreel of the revolution, as many people had hoped it would be. It was more like a meditation, a reflection. And of course, outside of Russia, Potemkin was seen as effectively just a call to revolution, to insurrection. So it was taken up by people in many countries for decades as the archetypal example of, the people being mown down by the Cossacks, a call to revolt. Nothing ideological, just revolt. October is a more complicated case because obviously the October Revolution had enormous significance, not just for people inside Russia, but also for many others outside. And many people pondered over what Eisenstein had made of the revolution. How was he portraying it? Because October is full of all sorts of observations on the nature of revolution, how they unleash torrents of sort of sexual energy. There's a very sexual aspect to October in all sorts of ways. It's a sort of meditation on how revolutions can get out of hand. They unleash energies. And that didn't go down too well with some of the comrades. Eisenstein's first film was The Strike, made in 1924 and shown in Russia quite successfully, and actually sent off to Paris, to the great expo in Paris, where it won a prize. But very few people got to see it, and it was never exported. It was really just put to one side, but it got Eisenstein the job of making Battleship Potemkin. That was its great success. And then, of course, in the 1960s, when people actually got a chance to see The Strike, they thought, my goodness, this is where it all comes from. And many people found themselves preferring Strike, which was fresh and new, to Battleship Potemkin, which had become a bit of a cliche. Eisenstein had tremendous prestige at the end of the 1920s, and if you had any ambitions to do something serious in film, you had to pay attention to Eisenstein. Whether or not you even went along with his politics, he was definitely the man to follow, because he was publishing theoretical articles at a time when no other filmmaker was doing that. So a whole range of responses to his work at the beginning of the 1930s. He was undoubtedly a model for people making documentaries, and you can see his influence on the documentary movement that started in the 1930s. Militant film, if you wanted to make a militant revolutionary film, then of course you look to Eisenstein and Podovkin and some of the other Russians. And he was also a model for those who wanted to make a really sophisticated avant-garde cinema that would match the best of modernist art, because Eisenstein was a modernist. He admired James Joyce enormously. D.H. Lawrence, surprisingly too, was a great hero of his. So he was in many different camps. People found in Eisenstein something that they could respond to.
Князь здешний, Александр. Невский твое прозвище?
Eisenstein re-established himself in the late 30s by making Alexander Nevsky. Alexander Nevsky was probably Eisenstein's most widely seen film. And when the war broke out, the fact that it actually shows the ordinary people of medieval Russia resisting the Nazi-like German Teutonic Knights made it very topical. A BBC producer, Dallas Bauer, had the idea of turning it into a radio play, a very potent medium at this time. And he commissioned Louis MacNeice, a poet, to write the text, brought in the score of the Prokofiev music, and as luck would have it, the performance was broadcast one day after Pearl Harbor, when America was finally in the war. It's very difficult to separate out the role that culture played at this time in bolstering the war effort. There was a whole cultural front, as it were. But at the same time, yes, it was helping to rally people, and many people would have seen the parallels between medieval Russia versus Germany and what they were up against in the current war.
Как ударит немец в буслая, не торопись, дай клину увязнуть. А потом с двух сторон разом и ударим.
Eisenstein and Vertov were two of the leading figures in early Soviet cinema. They were not best friends, it's fair to say. And really, the reasons why they were so opposed to each other, I think, are quite complex. On the one hand, Eisenstein believed in what he called Kino Fist. He believed that cinema should be cranked up to produce the maximum impact, physiological impact, to really kind of move people through the shock of the images. Vertov had a different idea. He spoke about Kino Eye, the cinema as a machine for showing everyday life. And he did show everyday life in his Chronicle series, Kino Pravda. But at the same time, he made a series of feature-length films, which were, of course, propaganda. Propaganda for the new Soviet state, for its trading activities, for its construction work. And in a way, you could say that Vertov's real opposition to Eisenstein was that he believed that you shouldn't tell stories. Eisenstein believed that you had to tell stories. And it sort of comes down to that. Vertov stood for a very pure, and to some people rather dogmatic, insistence that cinema must not get mixed up with the business of storytelling. This is what he called spiritual poison. And he wanted to purge cinema of its addiction to storytelling. Now, that made Vertov a very attractive figure when he was rediscovered in the 1960s, because he stood for something very pure, very unworldly, very outside of what we think of as propaganda film. Although there is a lot of propaganda in Vertov. Some of the early Soviet filmmakers cast a very long shadow, but the really interesting thing is to see how they get reinterpreted at different moments. We kind of reach out and we take from them what we want from them. So the Eisenstein was valued, let's say, in the 1930s and the 1940s, is a very different Eisenstein from the one that we rediscovered in the 60s, and indeed the one that we're rediscovering today. Vertov is a very good example of somebody who was completely forgotten. I mean, so forgotten it's not true, during the last years of his life, and he was rediscovered at the end of the 60s. He had arrived back at the right moment, and he was taken up by the new documentary filmmakers. His phrase, Kino Pravda, gave us the phrase cinema verite, which became one of the watchwords of the 1960s and 70s in the new documentary. The Man with the Movie Camera, which was Vertov's last desperate attempt to demonstrate that non-fiction cinema could be exciting and gripping, it was forgotten for a long time. It was condemned as being playing around with cinema, but then it was rediscovered, and it actually has become probably one of the top 10 favourite films of all time. It's certainly one of the best known of all silent films today. Why? Because it's so many things to so many different people. It's a city symphony. It's a demonstration of the power of cinema, of the playfulness of making a film about making a film about making a film. It's all of those things. It means so many different things to different people that it's become a kind of universal passport back to the joys of silent cinema. And there's no story that you have to hang on to. I guess we're suspicious of upfront propagandist filmmaking today. And in a way that's been bad for Soviet cinema, which often looks too crude, too simplistic, and too much trying to bang us over the head. For instance, it's very significant that the world's favourite Soviet filmmaker today is probably Andrei Tarkovsky, who very definitely saw himself as not making propagandist films, not even making Soviet films, but making Russian films in the Soviet era. That is what suits our temper today better. On the other hand, I think Soviet cinema continues to inspire people who find themselves in a revolutionary situation. Big influence, for instance, on the filmmakers of Latin America. If you look back through the history of Latin American filmmaking in the last recent decades, Soviet cinema keeps coming back as a model. Cuban filmmaking has taken a lot from Soviet cinema, and elsewhere in Latin America too. It's a kind of beacon of what cinema could be if it's at the service of a revolution.